In 1858, 19 armed Nightriders crossed the Georgia border to capture an aging black midwife. They carried rifles, torches, chains, and enough rope for everyone they expected to find. Sabella Quash waited for them with no firearm and no place to run. She had only a wooden mortar and a garden thick with thorns. Before sunrise, the riders had been divided, 12 fugitives had vanished, and the ground beneath the garden had begun exposing crimes the patrol believed were buried forever. The horses returned before the men did. 3 of them reached Belgrave Plantation shortly after sunrise, moving slowly through the front gate with torn reins dragging beneath their heads. Blood ran from shallow cuts along their legs. Briars clung to their saddles, bridles, and blankets. One horse carried no rider. Another carried a man slumped across the saddle, his coat ripped open from shoulder to waist. The third rider remained upright, but he had lost his rifle and one boot. None of them had brought back the 12 enslaved adults they had been sent to capture. The pursuit had started after midnight, when word reached Belgrave that a group had left the southern work quarters and entered the woods. The Nightriders expected a short chase. They knew the roads, the streams, and the crossings used by people trying to reach the Florida border. They had horses. They had guns. They had men stationed along the most likely routes. By dawn, the fugitives were gone. The riders claimed that the forest had closed around them. That was not true. Forests do not decide where men can pass. Someone had changed the paths. The first patrol entered a narrow trail less than 5 miles from the plantation. The ground appeared clear until the lead horse stepped between 2 walls of greenbrier. The passage narrowed sharply. Thorned branches caught the reins and pulled the rider sideways. The men behind him tried to turn. There was not enough room. One horse reared. Another backed into a concealed ditch. The third broke through a blackberry barrier and carried its rider away from the group. The fugitives did not stop to fight. They did not need to. They moved through a gap the horses could not enter and disappeared toward the swamp. Captain Ormond Crail inspected the animals when they returned. He did not accept panic as an explanation. Crail had led armed patrols along the Georgia-Florida border for years. Plantation owners paid him to capture fugitives, break hidden routes, and intimidate free black communities suspected of offering food or shelter. He treated the work as a profession. He recorded distances. He questioned stable workers. He studied footprints after rainfall. He knew how long a frightened person could move without water, and how quickly an exhausted group would begin leaving evidence behind. The disappearance of 12 people was not luck. It was organization. Crail cut one of the briars from a saddle and laid it across a table in the Belgrave stable. The stem had not grown naturally across the path. It had been bent and trained around a wooden support. Someone had placed it there. Within 2 weeks, another patrol found a road blocked by Cherokee rose. The plants were young, but their branches had been woven across the crossing at the height of a horse's chest. Several miles away, honey locust had been planted beside a shallow creek. Its long thorns forced mounted riders toward a patch of unstable mud. A third route was closed by blackberry canes rooted in a line too straight to be accidental. Each barrier appeared where horses were most vulnerable. Each one left a narrow opening for a person on foot. Crail ordered the riders to cut the plants down. The obstructions returned elsewhere. The pattern continued for months. Whenever the patrol cleared one road, another became difficult to cross. The changes were small enough to escape notice during daylight. At night, under speed, they became dangerous. Reins snapped, saddle straps tore. Horses refused to move forward. The Nightriders blamed the animals. Then they blamed the weather. Finally, they began blaming one another. Crail blamed the person who understood exactly how they traveled. A scout named Mercer brought him the first useful connection. He had seen the same plants growing behind a cabin at Belgrave Plantation. The cabin belonged to Sabella Quash. Sabella was 53 years old. She had been held at Belgrave for most of her adult life. She worked as a midwife and herbal healer, treating enslaved laborers when plantation owners considered a physician too expensive. She was also called into white households when ordinary remedies failed. She treated fever with bark preparations. She cleaned infected wounds. She reduced swelling in injured joints. She knew which roots caused sickness, which leaves lowered pain, and which plants could stop bleeding long enough for a person to survive. The same people who denied her freedom depended on her knowledge. Crail had depended on it himself. 2 years earlier, after a wound on his forearm became infected, he had come to Sabella after dark. She cleaned it, packed it with an herbal preparation, and told him to keep the bandage dry. He followed her instructions. His arm healed. That history made him careless. He saw Sabella as useful, controlled, and too old to become dangerous. He mistook restraint for obedience because the system around him required that mistake. Crail arrived at her cabin after sunset. He entered without permission. Sabella was seated at a small table, grinding dried leaves in a wooden mortar. A lamp burned beside her. Shelves behind her held cloth bundles, glass jars, roots, and labeled packets she could not legally own but had prepared anyway. Crail placed a thorn-covered branch across the table. It had been cut from the latest blocked root. Sabella looked at it once and continued grinding. Crail asked why plants from her garden were growing near the border. She did not answer immediately. He told her 3 horses had been injured and 12 people had escaped. He accused someone at Belgrave of planting obstacles along patrol roads. Sabella examined the branch more closely. "Birds carry seeds," she said. It was the only explanation she gave him. Crail told her birds did not weave branches around wooden frames. Sabella's hand stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent except for the lamp flame and the movement of a horse outside. Crail leaned across the table. He told her that if another patrol disappeared, he would return with men and axes. He would burn the garden, search the cabin, and question everyone connected to her. Sabella did not challenge him. She did not lower her eyes either. That refusal was small, but Crail noticed it. He left the branch on her table and walked out. Sabella remained seated until the sound of his horse faded beyond the quarters. She moved to the doorway and watched the darkness for several minutes. Then she returned to the table. She lifted the pestle. She struck the wooden mortar once. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. A thin cord ran beneath the rear wall of the cabin and disappeared into the garden. The vibration released a suspended piece of wood hidden among the trees. A second knock sounded farther away. Then another. The signal traveled beyond Belgrave through devices concealed along paths the patrol had never discovered. Several miles south, 12 fugitives were lying beneath reeds beside a black water channel. They had been waiting for Thorn Quash to guide them toward the next crossing. When the single knock reached them, Thorn raised his head. One strike meant the original route was no longer safe. They left the water immediately. No argument. No delay. Within minutes, the place where they had been hiding was empty. Crail believed he had just warned an aging midwife. In reality, he had confirmed that the Nightriders were watching the wrong road. Sabella removed the thorn branch from her table and carried it into the garden. She did not throw it away. She pressed its cut end into damp soil beside the others. By morning, Crail's evidence had become another planting. The Nightriders were searching for a hidden road, a stolen map, or an armed conspiracy. They were looking for resistance in forms they understood. They did not recognize it in the hands of a woman preparing medicine. They did not recognize it in roots spreading beneath the soil. And they did not recognize that every failed pursuit was teaching Sabella exactly how they would attack next. 7 years earlier, Sabella had not yet built a border defense. She was still trying to survive by making herself necessary. At Belgrave, necessity was the closest thing an enslaved person could reach to protection. It was not safety. It was only a delay. Sabella was called whenever a laborer collapsed, whenever infection entered a wound, whenever fever moved through the quarters. Plantation owners allowed her to treat people because replacing workers cost money. The same knowledge that kept them alive also kept the plantation functioning. She understood the contradiction. She also understood that refusing to work would not weaken the system before it killed someone else. So she treated the sick. She cleaned wounds with boiled water when there was enough fuel. She used bark for fever, crushed leaves for swelling, and bitter roots when pain prevented sleep. She worked under supervision when the patient was considered valuable and alone when the person was not. The distinction was not medical. It was economic. Thorn repaired the equipment that made Belgrave profitable. He fixed wagon wheels, straightened metal fittings, sharpened tools, and replaced horseshoes worn thin by patrol roads. He and Sabella lived in separate buildings but shared what little time the plantation left them. At night, they spoke quietly because walls carried sound and silence was often safer than honesty. For years, both believed caution might preserve them. That belief ended with a man who arrived after midnight. He emerged from the trees behind Sabella's cabin and collapsed before reaching the door. He had escaped from a patrol near the southern road. His shirt was stiff with dried blood. One ankle had swollen beyond the shape of the joint. He had been moving through the swamp for 2 days without proper food. Sabella and Thorn carried him inside. There was no time to ask his name. Thorn blocked the window with a blanket. Sabella cut away the ruined cloth around the wound and cleaned it. The injury itself was serious but survivable. The fever was not. The man drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he woke, he tried to rise. Sabella held him down. "You move now. They hear you." He stopped struggling. Before dawn, he asked for water. Then he told them why the patrol had not followed. The Nightriders had assumed he would die. He said Krail's men had captured 5 people that week. 2 were returned to plantations. 3 were taken toward an abandoned strip of ground close to the swamp. Only 1 came back. The man had seen enough before escaping to understand what the site was used for. The riders brought people there when they wanted no questions asked. Those who died during pursuit or interrogation were buried quickly, without markers, beyond the cultivated fields. No family was informed. No grave was recorded. The violence was hidden because the victims had already been denied legal control over their own bodies. Their deaths required less explanation than the loss of a horse. The man gave Sabella directions in fragments. A dead cypress split by lightning. A narrow creek with reddish mud. An old wagon path no longer used. 3 raised patches of ground beside a stand of palmetto. He repeated the details until his voice failed. He died before sunrise. Sabella and Thorn could not bury him near Belgrave. Fresh soil would be noticed. They carried him into the woods before the morning bell and concealed the grave beneath fallen branches. For several days, Sabella continued her routine. She delivered a child in the eastern quarters. She treated a foreman's infected hand. She prepared medicine for a plantation woman suffering from recurring fever. Nothing in her conduct changed. That was how resistance survived under constant observation. It moved behind ordinary work. On the 4th night, Sabella and Thorn followed the dead man's directions. They found the split cypress first, then the creek. The abandoned wagon path was nearly invisible, but Thorn identified the compressed ground where wheels had once passed. They moved without a lantern until the trees opened into a low clearing. The smell reached them before the evidence did. The graves had been covered badly. One had sunk in the center. Another had been disturbed by animals. A third contained a torn piece of cloth trapped beneath the soil. Thorn wanted to leave immediately. Sabella did not. She stood in the clearing and counted the raised patches. There were more than 3. Some were older. Grass had grown over them. Others were recent enough that the earth remained loose. The site was not temporary. It had been used repeatedly. They could not report it. Krail's patrols worked for men who controlled the courts, the roads, and the plantations. Testimony from Sabella would not expose the crime. It would expose her knowledge of it. Removing the bodies was impossible. Even marking the graves with stones would draw attention. Sabella returned the next night carrying cuttings from greenbrier and wild blackberry. She planted one above each disturbed section of ground. Thorn watched her work. At first, he thought she intended only to remember the locations. He was partly right. The plants were markers, but they were also difficult to remove. Greenbrier roots spread underground. Blackberry canes returned after cutting. Honey locust defended itself with thorns long enough to tear leather. Sabella was not choosing plants for beauty. She was choosing them for persistence. Over the following months, she began studying where each species survived best. She tested cuttings beside wet ground and on dry slopes. She learned which stems could be bent without breaking and which roots could be divided and replanted. She selected the plants that grew fastest and produced the strongest thorns. There was no laboratory and no formal language for what she was doing. There was observation, repetition, and memory. The plantation dismissed that knowledge because it came from an enslaved black woman working with soil. That dismissal gave her room to continue. Thorn became involved slowly. He first built small wooden supports to keep young plants upright. Then he altered them. He buried narrow frames beneath the soil so branches could be trained into deliberate shapes. A line of briars became a barrier. A barrier became a channel. A channel became a path wide enough for one person and too narrow for a horse. They began near the burial ground. Then they extended the system toward the swamp. Sabella used her work as cover. She told overseers she needed plants that did not grow near Belgrave. She left with a basket and returned with roots, bark, and seeds. Some of those materials entered her medicine stores. Others disappeared into hidden planting sites. Thorn used wagon repairs to study the patrol routes. Every damaged wheel and torn harness revealed where riders moved fastest, where the ground narrowed, and where horses struggled after heavy rain. He understood weight and pressure. Sabella understood growth. Together, they began altering the border without changing anything large enough to attract immediate attention. The first practical test came during a storm. 2 enslaved men from a neighboring plantation reached Belgrave after dark. They were exhausted and had no guide. Sabella did not lead them openly. She showed them a bent branch near the edge of the garden and told them to look for the same shape farther south. 1 bent branch meant continue. 2 branches crossed low meant leave the trail. White flowers tied near the base of a bush meant water was close. A cleared patch with no plant growth meant stop. The instructions were simple because fear destroys memory. The men left before midnight. The next morning, a patrol passed through the same area and missed the turn. Both men reached the swamp. That success changed the purpose of the garden. It was no longer only a memorial. Sabella began building a language into the land. Dried gourds were suspended beneath leaves. Thin wooden pieces were fixed between trees. Certain vines were connected to hidden lines beside the narrow roots. A person walking carefully could pass without making sound. A horse pushing through the wrong opening struck the line. 1 knock warned of movement. 2 meant mounted riders. 3 meant the route ahead was compromised. The signals could travel from one concealed station to another faster than a patrol could move through dense ground. Sabella trained only a few people at first. Each person learned one section, never the whole system. If captured, they could reveal only a fragment. Thorn alone understood the full structure. That was deliberate. A network survives betrayal by limiting what any one person can destroy. Year by year, the thorn corridors spread. The burial ground remained at the center, but the roots extended outward toward creeks, abandoned cabins, and dry islands inside the swamp. Food was hidden beneath false root beds. Water containers were buried near flowering markers. Low tunnels passed beneath the thickest briars. 38 adults crossed through the system over 7 years. Some traveled alone. Some moved in groups. Not all survived beyond the border. Sabella could not control what waited after the swamp. But the patrols failed often enough for Krail to notice. He saw missing people, damaged equipment, and blocked roads. He did not see the structure connecting them. He believed resistance required guns, meetings, or written plans. Sabella used none of those. She used roots that returned after cutting. She used sound that vanished after it was heard. She used the patrol's dependence on horses against men who believed mobility belonged only to them. By the time Krail carried the thorn branch into her cabin, the garden was no longer one place behind Belgrave. It stretched across miles. Its oldest roots held the positions of the dead. Its newest paths carried the living away. And the woman Krail considered useful had already spent 7 years turning that usefulness against him. Silas Red was captured because one horse returned to Belgrave without a proper shoe. The animal had thrown iron on the eastern road and come back limping. When Krail inspected the hoof, he found the nails had not failed from wear. They had been loosened. Silas worked in the stable. He had shod Krail's patrol horses for 5 years. He knew which animals were used for night pursuit, which riders carried spare ammunition, and which saddles were assigned to the fastest men. He also knew how little damage was required to delay a patrol without making sabotage obvious. A nail driven at the wrong angle could work loose after several miles. A leather strap cut halfway through would survive inspection and fail under pressure. A stone left beneath a saddle blanket could make a horse difficult to control before the rider understood why. Silas never disabled every animal. That would have exposed him immediately. He damaged one part, then waited. A patrol delayed by 20 minutes could lose a trail. A rider forced to dismount could separate from the others. Those small failures had helped Sabella's network more than any direct attack. Crail understood that possibility after the third inspection. He ordered Silas brought into the tack room. The door remained closed for most of the afternoon. The men outside heard questions, then silence, then the sound of furniture striking the wall. Crail did not need a public punishment. He needed information, and public cruelty often produced witnesses without producing truth. By sunset, Silas was tied to a chair. Crail placed the damaged horseshoe on a table in front of him. He asked who had instructed him to weaken the patrol animals. Silas said no one. Crail asked which routes Sabella used. Silas gave the same answer. The questioning continued through the night. Crail's method was controlled. He repeated details already known and watched for hesitation. He mentioned the Thorn barriers. He named 2 fugitives who had disappeared near Belgrave. He claimed Tavern had already confessed. That was false. Silas knew it was false because Tavern would have been brought into the room if Crail had him. He kept silent. By morning, Crail changed tactics. He told Silas that Sabella would be taken whether he spoke or not. He said the garden would be burned, the cabins searched, and everyone connected to her questioned. If Silas cooperated, Crail claimed, only the leaders would be punished. The offer had no value. Men like Crail used mercy as bait because they had no intention of honoring it. The plantation system did not reward truth. It rewarded submission, and even submission offered no guarantee of survival. Silas lowered his head and gave Crail what appeared to be a confession. He said Sabella was preparing a large escape for the next moonless night. He said people from several plantations would gather behind her cabin, enter the Thorn garden, and move south before dawn. He described an opening hidden behind a wall of blackberry canes. He gave Crail a route. The details were precise. That was why Crail believed him. Crail did not know Sabella had prepared Silas for this moment months earlier. She had never asked whether he could withstand an interrogation. That question would have been useless. Pain, exhaustion, and fear could break anyone. Resistance built on the fantasy of perfect courage was resistance designed to fail. Instead, she told him what to reveal. If captured, he was to name her. He was to describe the garden. He was to give the riders a real entrance leading into a false corridor. Most importantly, he was to tell them the escape would begin from Belgrave. The lie depended on truth. Sabella did maintain routes behind her cabin. People had passed through them before. The Thorn opening existed. The signals were real. Crail would inspect the information and confirm enough of it to trust the rest. Silas did not betray the network. He performed the role assigned to him. The cost was that no one outside the room could know that. By afternoon, the story had already spread through Belgrave. Stable workers saw Silas being dragged across the yard. They saw Crail speaking with plantation overseers. They saw riders studying the southern paths. To them, Silas appeared to have surrendered Sabella. Fear turned quickly into anger. One man refused to look at him. A woman who had once carried messages through the garden spat near his feet as he passed. Silas did not defend himself. The deception could succeed only if the plantation believed it. Sabella heard of the confession before sunset. She was preparing a fever remedy when Tavern entered the cabin and closed the door behind him. He told her Crail was assembling men. He told her Silas had named the garden. Sabella continued, tying the cloth around the medicine packet. Tavern watched her hands. Did he break? He followed the instruction? Tavern did not answer. Silas had done exactly what Sabella required, but the timing was worse than expected. The planned escape involved adults from 4 plantations. Some had already left their quarters. Others were waiting for patrol rotations to change. The operation could not be postponed. Messages had been carried for weeks through people whose names Sabella did not know. Food had been stored along 3 routes. Guides were positioned near 2 creek crossings and a dry ridge inside the swamp. If Sabella canceled the movement, the hidden supplies might be discovered. The participants would be left exposed. Some had already created absences that could not be explained by morning. Tavern said they should leave Belgrave immediately. They could enter the western corridor before Krail surrounded the garden. Silas had given the riders the southern entrance, leaving another route open. Sabella refused. If she disappeared, Krail would understand that Silas's confession had warned her. He would divide his men and place patrols across every border road. The larger escape would collapse. The Nightriders needed to believe they had trapped the organizers in one place. Sabella intended to give them that belief. She told Tavern to move the first groups earlier than planned. The adults from the western plantation would enter the swamp before midnight. The second group would cross the abandoned wagon road 2 hours later. The final group would wait near the creek until they heard the mortar signal. Tavern studied her face. He understood what she was proposing. Krail would bring armed men to the garden. Sabella would remain visible. Tavern would keep the routes open until the last possible moment. There would be no reliable escape for either of them. "You built it to carry people out," he said. "I built it to hold riders back, not 19. Then it holds 19. The decision was not heroic. It was calculated. Sabella knew Krail's habits. A smaller patrol might search carefully. A larger one would rely on force. More horses meant more congestion. More armed men meant more confusion once the paths narrowed. Krail believed numbers would give him control. Inside the garden, numbers would make control harder. That evening, he confirmed the moon would be absent and sent riders to 3 nearby plantations. He demanded men, axes, torches, chains, and rope. He told the plantation owners he had uncovered a coordinated escape network centered at Belgrave. They responded quickly. They were less disturbed by hidden killings than by hidden organization. A single fugitive could be punished. A functioning route threatened the entire economic order. By midnight, 19 Nightriders had gathered near the northern road. Krail divided them into advance, containment, and pursuit groups. He ordered them not to fire unless necessary. Sabella was to be taken alive. Tavern was to be separated from her. Any others found in the garden were to be restrained before questioning. He expected dozens of fugitives. That expectation was the trap. While the riders checked weapons and tightened saddles, the first escape group was already moving through waist-deep water several miles away. The second crossed a narrow ridge before the patrol reached Belgrave. The third waited beside the creek for Tavern. Silas remained locked in a storage building near the stable. His hands were swollen, and he could barely stand. But through a crack in the wall, he heard the riders leaving. 19 horses, one after another, all moving toward Sabella. For the first time since his capture, Silas allowed himself to close his eyes. The lie had worked. Krail had pulled nearly every available rider away from the roads. At Belgrave, Sabella removed jars from the shelves and placed them beneath the floor. She took only the wooden mortar, the pestle, and a small knife used for roots. Tavern checked the western exit one final time. Then he returned to her cabin. Neither spoke about what would happen if the garden failed. There was no useful language for that. Outside, the first distant hoofbeats reached the edge of the plantation. Sabella extinguished the lamp. The Nightriders believed they were approaching the center of the escape network. In fact, the network was moving around them. The people Krail intended to capture were already leaving Georgia. The only figures still waiting at Belgrave were the 2 people prepared to make sure he never realized it in time. The riders entered Belgrave from 3 directions. Krail had studied the plantation road before choosing his positions. 6 men remained near the northern fence. 5 moved toward the western tree line. The rest followed him through the main yard toward Sabella's cabin. He wanted the garden surrounded before anyone inside understood how many men had come. The plan assumed surprise. That assumption failed before the first horse reached the herbs. Sabella was already outside. She stood between 2 narrow rows of plants with the wooden mortar placed at her feet. The cabin behind her was dark. No fugitives were visible. No wagons waited near the road. There were no bundles, no food stores, and no sign that dozens of people had gathered there. Crail slowed his horse. For several seconds, neither side moved. The Nightriders had expected confusion. They expected people running from cabins, bodies pressing against hidden exits, and Sabella attempting to disappear into the same garden she had built. Instead, they found one woman standing in open ground. That disturbed them more than flight would have. Crail dismounted and approached with 4 men. He ordered Sabella away from the plants. She remained where she was. He asked where the others had gone. Sabella said nothing. Crail looked toward the cabin and signaled 2 men forward. They entered with weapons raised, overturned the table, pulled bedding from the wall, and searched beneath the floorboards. They found jars, cloth, dried roots, and tools used for preparing medicine. No people, no maps, no weapons. Crail turned back to Sabella. He had brought 19 armed men because Silas had described a mass gathering. The absence of that gathering should have warned him. Instead, it made him more aggressive. Men who build power through fear cannot easily admit they have been deceived. They respond by increasing force, as though violence can repair a failed judgment. Crail ordered his riders into the garden. The first group moved toward the southern opening described by Silas. The second took positions near the western route. 2 men remained behind Sabella. Crail stepped closer. "Where are they?" Sabella looked beyond him toward the dark road. The first escape group had already entered the swamp. The second should have crossed the wagon ridge. The last remained near the creek, waiting for confirmation that the patrol had fully committed to Belgrave. Sabella needed to send that confirmation. She bent down slowly. One of the riders raised his rifle. Crail stopped him. Sabella lifted the pestle and struck the mortar 3 times. The sound was dry and controlled. Knock, knock, knock. Crail grabbed her wrist before she could move again. The signal had already left the garden. A cord beneath the soil tightened and released a narrow wooden tongue against a hollow board. The same pattern sounded behind the cabin, then farther south. 3 knocks. The message passed through stations hidden beneath vines and low branches. At the creek, Tavern heard the final echo. He had reached the waiting group minutes earlier. 11 adults were crouched beneath the trees, carrying only what they could move with quickly. One woman supported a man whose leg had been injured during the approach. Another held a wrapped bundle of food against her chest. They did not know the Nightriders had surrounded Belgrave. Tavern did. 3 knocks meant the riders had entered the garden. It also meant the last route had to open immediately. He pulled aside a section of woven briars and exposed a passage running along the creek bed. The opening was low and nearly invisible from the road. He sent the group through 1 person at a time. No speeches were given. There was no time for gratitude. The first person entered. Then the second. Tavern counted them as they passed. 7, 8, 9. The final 2 disappeared beneath the thorns. Tavern closed the opening behind them. He should have followed. Instead, he heard horses approaching from the north. Crail had placed riders beyond the garden in case anyone escaped the first enclosure. 2 of them had noticed movement near the creek and followed the sound. Tavern moved away from the hidden passage to draw them off. He stepped onto open ground and began running east. The riders saw him immediately. They pursued. Tavern knew the terrain, but he had spent the night opening routes, carrying supplies, and moving between signal points. He was exhausted before the chase began. He crossed 1 shallow ditch and reached the abandoned wagon road. The second horse closed the distance. A rider struck him from behind with the side of a weapon. Tavern fell, rose once, and was forced down again. The last escape group continued south without seeing his capture. That was the result he had chosen. Back at Belgrave, Crail ordered Sabella's hands bound. The garden had begun answering her signal. Hidden boards knocked in the darkness. Gourds clicked against branches. The sounds came from different distances, suggesting movement where none could be seen. The riders turned toward each new noise. Crail did not. He understood enough to know the rhythm carried information. He demanded that Sabella explain what 3 knocks meant. She looked at him without answering. He struck the mortar aside with his boot. It rolled against the base of a thorn trellis. Then the riders returned with Thorn. They dragged him through the western opening with his wrists tied behind him. His shirt was torn, and one side of his face was swollen. He remained conscious. Sabella's expression changed when she saw him. Only slightly. Krail noticed. He moved Thorn into the center of the garden and forced him to his knees beside the mortar. This was the first real leverage he had obtained. He told Sabella the garden would be cut apart before sunrise. He said every cabin connected to her would be searched. Anyone found missing would be hunted through the swamp. Then he gave her a choice. She could identify the routes, the guides, and the locations of the hidden supplies, or Thorn would die in front of her. The demand exposed the structure Krail represented. He had spent years enforcing a system that separated husbands from wives, sold people without warning, and treated attachment as a weakness to be exploited. Now he expected love to produce obedience. Sabella looked down at Thorn. For nearly 30 years, they had worked in the same machinery of control. She had treated bodies damaged by labor. He had repaired tools that returned people to that labor. Both had survived by making themselves useful while quietly building something the plantation could not see. Thorn knew every path. He knew where food had been buried, where the warning lines crossed, and which sections of the garden could be opened from the inside. If he spoke, Krail could damage the network. If Sabella spoke, the damage would be worse. Krail ordered one of his men to raise his weapon. Thorn looked at Sabella. He did not ask her to save him. He shook his head once. The movement was small, but it ended the argument between them. Sabella understood what remained unfinished. The final group had entered the creek route, but they had not yet reached the dry ridge. A fourth signal was required. It would tell the distant guides to close the path behind them and redirect any pursuit toward the eastern marsh. Without it, the group could still be overtaken. Sabella bent toward the mortar. Krail tightened his grip on her arm. She pulled free enough to reach the pestle. One of the riders shouted. Sabella struck the mortar a fourth time. The sound carried across the garden. Krail fired. Thorn fell beside the thorn roots he had helped place beneath the soil. The violence was immediate and deliberate. It was not a loss of control. It was Krail's method of restoring authority after Sabella refused his terms. For a moment, the garden became silent. Sabella looked at Thorn's body. She did not cry out. She did not move toward him. The riders were waiting for collapse because they believed grief would complete what the weapon had started. Instead, Sabella remained standing. The fourth knock traveled beneath them. At the creek, a guide heard it and pulled the last woven barrier into place. The escape route closed. 11 people continued toward the border. Then the garden answered. One hidden clapper sounded near the northern fence. Another struck from the western trees. A third replied beyond the southern path. Within seconds, dozens of separate rhythms moved through the darkness. The Nightriders turned in every direction. Some believed people were surrounding them. Others thought the fugitives were still inside the garden. Horses shifted, pulled against reins, and refused to stand still. Krail looked from Sabella to the black wall of thorns. He had killed Thorn to force the garden into silence. Instead, Thorn's death had completed the signal. Sabella finally lowered her eyes to the ground beside him. His blood was disappearing into soil, covering roots he had helped direct years earlier. The last group was moving beyond Krail's reach. That was the fact Sabella held on to. Not victory, not revenge, completion. Krail had taken her husband and still failed to stop the escape. The riders had surrounded the garden, but the people they came to capture were already gone. And now every hidden sound inside the darkness was telling Sabella exactly where the Nightriders stood. Krail's first order was to burn the western edge. He believed fire would strip the garden of concealment and force anyone still hiding inside to move. It was the response of a man trained to destroy what he could not control. 2 riders carried torches toward a wall of blackberry and greenbrier. They expected dry brush. What they found was living growth, thick with moisture and packed around buried wood. The outer leaves caught first. Smoke rose low and heavy. The flames did not spread cleanly. They smoldered through tangled vines, then moved along strips of dried bark Sabella had placed where she wanted heat to travel. Krail saw only fire. He did not see direction. The first horse reacted before the riders did. Smoke entered its eyes and nostrils. It pulled backward, struck another animal, and twisted the line of men behind it. A second horse tried to turn inside a passage barely wide enough to move forward. Its saddle caught on a thorn arch. The rider pulled harder. The arch held. Behind him, 3 men pushed into the same lane. The space collapsed into noise, leather, and frightened animals. Rifles struck branches, reins crossed. One man lost his seat and disappeared beneath the horses. The Nightriders had entered as a coordinated force. Within minutes, they were no longer moving under one command. That was the garden's first real purpose. It did not need to overpower armed men. It only needed to separate them. The passages had been built around the habits of mounted patrols. Riders chose open ground. Horses avoided dense growth. Men under pressure followed the person in front of them, even when the route had already narrowed. Sabella and Thorn had spent years observing those instincts. Now the riders obeyed them exactly. A wide path near the southern border appeared to lead away from the smoke. 6 men entered it at speed. After 30 yards, the path split around a stand of honey locust. The left side curved back toward the garden center. The right side descended into soft ground hidden beneath pine needles. The first horse crossed. The second sank to the knee. The third collided with it. The men behind them stopped too late. One fired into the air, believing the movement ahead was an ambush. Another answered from the opposite side of the garden. The shot revealed their position to every hidden listener beyond the trees. A suspended gourd struck a branch twice. 2 knocks moved east. Another device answered farther south. The system was no longer warning fugitives about patrols. The fugitives were gone. Now it was reporting the patrols to those who had remained behind. Krail heard the signals but could not interpret them. Each sound seemed to come from a different direction. He began sending men toward the noise, not understanding that the noise was produced by their own movement. Every attempt to regain control generated another message. A boot pressed a buried board. A horse's chest touched a thin vine. A rifle barrel caught a hanging cord. The garden recorded them without paper and transmitted their position without speech. Krail ordered the men to dismount. The command reached only those nearest him. Others had already moved beyond hearing. Sabella remained beside Thorn's body with her wrists tied. 2 riders guarded her, but both watched the smoke instead of the prisoner. She could identify each section by sound. A low, hollow knock meant the northern lane. A sharp double strike meant the creek passage. A rattling sequence marked the false route Silas had described. She knew where Krail's men were without seeing them. She also knew which parts of the garden were failing. Fire had reached one of Thorn's buried frames. The wood cracked beneath the soil. A thorn wall slumped inward and opened a gap that had never existed before. 3 riders saw it. They believed they had found a hidden exit. They entered single file. The opening led into a circular corridor screened by Cherokee rows. The path bent gradually, too slowly for a rider to recognize the turn. After several minutes, the lead man saw smoke ahead and assumed he was approaching the far side. He had returned to the same fire. By the time the group understood, another fallen trellis blocked the passage behind them. The trap contained no blade, no mechanism, and no person waiting to attack. It relied on confusion. That made it harder to defeat. The riders had been trained to respond to visible threats. They knew how to pursue a body, break down a door, or surround a cabin. They had no method for fighting a landscape arranged to exploit their impatience. Krail moved toward the western lane, calling names. Only 2 men answered. One emerged without his horse. His coat had been torn open, and blood ran from cuts across his hands. He said the others had disappeared into the smoke. They had not disappeared. They had been divided by turns, fallen branches, frightened animals, and their own refusal to slow down. Krail struck him and ordered him back inside. The man hesitated. That hesitation was new. The Nightriders obeyed Krail because they believed he understood the terrain better than the people they hunted. The garden was dismantling that belief. Each failed command weakened him further. Near the northern fence, 4 riders abandoned their horses and continued on foot. Without the animals, they moved more carefully. For several minutes, they made progress. Then they found a section of open soil. The ground was clear, level, and free of thorns. It looked safer than everything around it. The first man stepped forward. The soil shifted under his weight. He dropped to one knee as a thin covering of branches broke beneath him. The depression was shallow, designed to delay rather than kill, but his rifle struck the ground and discharged. The shot wounded no one. Its effect was psychological. The men behind him stopped advancing. One began insisting that every open patch concealed another pit. Another refused to move until daylight. Their fear did what the thorns could not. It held them in place. Sabella watched the nearest guard move toward the sound. The second followed. For the first time, no one stood beside her. She could have run. The eastern passage remained open, and she knew how to enter it without touching the signal lines. She did not move. Tavern still lay beside the mortar. Leaving him would have increased her chance of survival. Staying offered no tactical advantage. But Sabella understood that Krail had not yet seen the center of the garden. He still believed the fugitives had hidden weapons, supplies, or documents somewhere inside. He would keep searching until he found something he could present as proof. The truth beneath the oldest roots was more dangerous than anything he expected to uncover. Sabella remained because the garden had one final purpose. It was not enough for Krail to be delayed. He had to expose himself. The smoke shifted. Through it, Sabella saw 3 men forcing their way toward the oldest thorn growth near the burial ground. They hacked at the outer branches with axes. Each cut opened the plants but also made movement harder. Loose canes dropped across their shoulders and wrapped around tool handles. One man shouted that there was wood beneath the roots. Krail heard him. He pushed through the central lane and reached the site with 2 riders. The structure looked different from the rest of the garden. The oldest bushes had grown thick enough to form a dark mass around a raised section of earth. Krail assumed it concealed the entrance to an underground shelter. He ordered the men to clear it. Sabella closed her eyes once, not in surrender, in recognition. The riders had finally reached the place she had protected for 7 years. Axes struck the thorn stems. The outer wall began to fall. Behind them, the garden continued, dividing the patrol. 5 groups were now separated across the property. Several horses had broken free. 2 fires were moving in opposite directions. No one knew how many men remained under Krail's command. The force that entered Belgrave as a single body had been reduced to scattered voices and smoke. Krail did not stop. He pointed to the raised ground and ordered the men to dig. One rider found a shovel near Sabella's cabin and drove it beneath the oldest roots. The soil gave way more easily than expected. The blade struck something hard. The man paused. Krail told him to continue. A second strike exposed a pale curve beneath the dirt. At first, the men thought it was part of the buried wooden frame. Then the rider cleared the soil with his hand. It was not wood. Sabella opened her eyes. Krail had spent years using this ground because he believed the dead beneath it had no witnesses. Now his own men were uncovering them. The first bone exposed beneath the thorn roots was part of a human forearm. The rider holding the shovel stepped back. Krail moved forward and looked into the opening. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he claimed the remains belonged to a fugitive who had died in the swamp. The explanation came too quickly. One body might have supported that lie. The second grave did not. A rider clearing loose soil uncovered fragments of cloth, a rusted buckle, and another set of remains less than 6 feet away. The burial was shallow. The body had been placed on its side and covered without care. The men stopped digging. Krail ordered them to continue. He needed the ground closed again before they understood what they were seeing. But his command produced the opposite result. Each shovel exposed more evidence. A third depression appeared beneath a honey locust, then a fourth. The oldest section of Sabella's garden was not covering one accidental death. It was marking a repeated practice. The burial ground extended beneath the thorns. Krail told the riders that enslaved people often died while escaping. He said bodies had been placed there to prevent disease and protect the nearby plantations. The men knew that was false. Bodies found during official pursuits were supposed to be reported. Owners demanded compensation for deaths. Patrol leaders recorded captures because payment depended on proof. These graves had no markers, no records, and no visible effort to identify the dead. They had been hidden. The difference mattered even to men who had accepted the violence of the patrol system. Some of them had joined for money, property favors, or protection from local authorities. They had agreed to hunt people. They had not agreed to carry Crail's private crimes. One rider asked how long the site had been used. Crail turned on him. He ordered everyone away from the graves. No one moved. Authority based on certainty begins to weaken when witnesses recognize fear in the man giving orders. Crail had commanded the garden while believing he controlled the facts. Now the evidence beneath the soil belonged to anyone who could see it. Sabella remained several yards away, her wrists still bound. Smoke passed between her and the opened graves. Behind Crail, one of the thorn bushes burned down to a blackened frame. Its roots remained fixed around the burial mound. Crail crossed the clearing and seized Sabella by the arm. He demanded to know how she had found the bodies. She answered him for the first time since Tavern's death. One man lived long enough to speak. Crail stared at her. The statement gave him no name to pursue and no witness to silence. The man who had revealed the burial ground had already died years earlier. Sabella had preserved what he told her without writing it down. Crail asked how many graves she had marked. Sabella looked across the oldest section of the garden. Each large thorn growth stood above disturbed ground. Some marked individual burials. Others covered places where more than one person had been placed. She had counted them when she first found the clearing. She had counted them again every season as the roots spread. Enough to know this was no accident. Crail struck her. The blow turned her face, but she stayed upright. He accused her of inventing the story to protect fugitives. Sabella looked at the bones exposed by his own men. She did not need to argue. The ground had already rejected his version. One rider recognized a metal clasp near the second grave. It had belonged to a man captured 2 years earlier on a neighboring plantation. Crail had reported that the prisoner escaped during transport. The clasp had been made by a local smith. Its shape was distinctive. The rider had seen it before. He said the missing man's name aloud. Crail ordered him to be silent. That command confirmed more than the identification itself. The Nightriders began looking at one another. Several had participated in pursuits where prisoners disappeared after Crail separated them from the group. Until that moment, each incident could be dismissed as escape, injury, or rumor. The graves connected them. Crail had used the patrol's authority to commit killings outside even the brutal rules imposed by the plantation owners. He had assumed the enslaved dead would leave no record strong enough to threaten him. Sabella had created one. She had not written names in a ledger Crail could seize. She had planted roots. The garden stored location. Its paths protected the graves. Its barriers delayed the men who had made them. Its signals drew witnesses toward the place where the truth had been hidden. The system had mistaken Sabella's work for submission because it could not imagine a black woman's knowledge operating beyond the service of those who owned her labor. That mistake now stood exposed in the clearing. Crail dragged Sabella toward the open ground and forced her beside the first grave. He told her he would burn every plant and scatter every bone into the swamp. Sabella said the fire had already done what she needed. Smoke from Belgrave was visible beyond the plantation. The hidden clappers had carried the alarm south. Free black settlements near the Florida line knew something had happened. Patrol horses had broken loose and were already moving without riders toward neighboring roads. Crail could destroy the site. He could not restore secrecy. Several of his own men had seen the graves. Even if they remained loyal, each now held information the others could use against him. Crail looked toward the surrounding smoke. For the first time, the garden no longer appeared to him as a physical obstacle. It had become a witness network. He ordered 2 riders to gather the remains and return them to the ground. Neither obeyed immediately. One asked what would be reported to the Belgrave owner. Crail answered that nothing would be reported. The rider stepped away from the shovel. That refusal was small, but it divided the patrol further than any Thorn corridor had. Crail drew his pistol. He said every man present had participated in the night's operation. If the graves became public, all of them could be blamed. He was no longer commanding them through confidence. He was binding them through shared danger. Some men accepted the threat. Others began calculating whether Krail's death would protect them better than his survival. Sabella watched the shift. She had not expected justice from the Nightriders. Men who enforced captivity did not become innocent because one crime exceeded their private limits. But fear could make them unreliable. That was enough. Krail pointed the weapon at Sabella and asked what else lay beneath the garden. She told him the truth. The graves were only the center. Every person guided through the Thorn network had learned part of its language. Every successful crossing had carried that knowledge farther from Belgrave. Destroying the garden would not destroy the method. Krail refused to believe her. He still imagined resistance as a structure with leaders, headquarters, and a single point of failure. He needed Sabella to be the center because then killing her would restore order. She told him the garden had never belonged only to her. Tavern had built the buried frames. Silas had delayed the horses. Guides had memorized the signals. Fugitives had replanted cuttings beyond the border. The system was already distributed among people Krail could not identify. That was the threat he had failed to see. The garden was not a fortress protecting one woman. It was instruction. Krail pressed the pistol against Sabella's side and ordered the remaining riders to bring torches. He would burn the entire clearing, kill her, and blame the graves on fugitives who had used the land as a burial site. The lie was crude, but Krail no longer needed it to be convincing. He needed only enough confusion for plantation owners to choose silence over investigation. 2 men moved toward the fire. A third began covering the exposed bones. Then a new rhythm sounded beyond the southern trees. It was not produced by a horse or a rider touching one of Sabella's lines. 3 knocks. A pause. 2 more. Sabella recognized the signal. Someone had entered the garden deliberately. Krail turned toward the sound. Figures appeared through the smoke at the edge of the clearing. The first was Silas Red. He walked with difficulty, but he was no longer bound. Behind him stood armed free black men from the Florida side of the border and several adults who had crossed through Sabella's routes earlier that night. They had followed the signals back. Krail had spent the night trying to isolate the midwife. Instead, he had opened the graves, divided his own men, and called witnesses directly to the crime scene. Silas looked at Tavern's body. Then he looked at Krail. The false confession had brought 19 Nightriders into the garden. Now the garden had closed around the man who believed he controlled them. Silas entered the clearing first. He was unarmed when Krail last saw him. Now he carried a short rifle taken from the Belgrave storage room. His steps were uneven, and one side of his face remained swollen from the interrogation. Behind him came 7 armed men from the Florida border settlements. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, boatmen, timber workers, and former fugitives who understood what Krail's patrols did beyond the reach of witnesses. Several had followed Sabella's routes before. Others had lost relatives along the same roads. 3 people from the final escape group stood behind them. They had crossed the creek passage, reached the dry ridge, and then heard the signal change. The garden had not called them back for rescue. It had called them back as witnesses. Krail kept his pistol against Sabella. The remaining Nightriders spread across the clearing, but their formation no longer existed. Some were injured. Some had lost their horses. Others had seen the graves and no longer knew whether protecting Krail would save them or condemn them. Silas looked at Tavern's body. He did not speak. There was nothing useful to say. Krail ordered him to lower the rifle. Silas continued forward until he stood beside the first open grave. Then he told the riders what Krail had done in the tack room. He described the questions, the threats, and the false promise that cooperation would protect everyone else. He admitted that he had named Sabella and revealed the southern entrance. Several Nightriders looked toward her. Silas finished the confession. He told them Sabella had instructed him to do it. The entrance was real. The gathering was not. The entire patrol had been drawn to Belgrave while adults from 4 plantations crossed elsewhere. Krail's face changed. Until that moment, he had believed Silas broke under pressure and accidentally exposed the network. Now he understood that the interrogation itself had been used against him. He had not discovered the trap. He had completed it. Krail fired towards Silas. Sabella drove her shoulder into his arm at the same moment. The shot struck a tree. Silas and 2 men from the border settlements raised their weapons. No one fired again. The clearing settled into a silence held together by fear. Krail released Sabella and moved backward toward the southern path. He called for his men to follow. Only 3 did. The others remained near the graves. Their refusal was not courage. They had spent years enforcing a system built on capture, forced labor, and terror. But Krail had now become a liability. The bodies beneath the garden could be connected to him. Protecting him offered no clear advantage. Men who serve power often abandon it only when it can no longer protect them. Krail turned and entered the route Silas had described. He believed it led out of the garden. Silas did not stop him. The path was wide enough for 1 rider and marked by broken blackberry canes. Krail had inspected it before the siege. He knew it existed. What he did not know was where it ended. The corridor curved away from Belgrave and descended gradually toward the marsh. Burned briars narrowed the opening behind him. Soft ground replaced packed soil. Krail moved faster. The men following him slowed when mud reached their ankles. 1 turned back. The other 2 continued until Krail stepped through a thin surface of roots and sank to the knee. He tried to pull free. The movement drove him deeper. He dropped the pistol and reached for a branch. The branch had been cut partway through months earlier. It broke under his weight. The marsh was not deep enough to swallow him. That had never been its purpose. It held him in open ground without a weapon, separated from his men and visible from the ridge. Silas reached the edge of the path with Sabella and the others behind him. Krail demanded assistance. No one moved. He reminded the surviving Nightriders that he knew their names and the patrols they had joined. He threatened to expose all of them if they abandoned him. The threat only confirmed what they feared. 2 men entered the marsh and pulled Krail free. They did not return his pistol. They bound his hands. Krail was taken back through the garden he had entered as commander. By the time he reached the clearing, he was a prisoner of men who had obeyed him less than an hour earlier. Silas asked Sabella what should be done with him. Every person present understood the question. Krail had killed Tavrin. He had buried others without names. He had used the border as a private killing ground because he believed the people he hunted had no authority capable of judging him. Sabella could have ended his life there. No one would have defended him. She refused. Not because Krail deserved mercy, because his death would have allowed the plantation owners to reduce the night to a clash between fugitives and patrolmen. They would describe the graves as rumor, the garden as criminal concealment, and Krail as a man killed before he could answer accusations. Alive, he remained attached to the evidence. Sabella ordered him taken to the opened graves. The bordermen forced him to stand beside them. She began naming the dead. Some names had come from families who asked her about relatives who never returned. Others came from the dying man who first revealed the burial ground. A few were uncertain, preserved only as descriptions of scars, clothing, trades, or the plantations from which they had fled. Sabella did not invent certainty where none existed. She stated what was known. She also stated what Krail had tried to erase. One of the surviving fugitives recognized the cloth found beneath the second thorn bush. It had belonged to her brother. A former patrol rider identified the clasp near another grave. The evidence accumulated through memory, objects, and the arrangement of the soil. Krail denied each accusation. His denials became weaker as more people spoke. The garden had forced into one place what slavery depended on keeping separate: the dead, the witnesses, the fugitives, the patrolmen, and the woman whose knowledge connected them. There would be no court capable of delivering clean justice. The law in Georgia recognized the property claims of enslavers more readily than the testimony of the people standing in that clearing. Sabella understood that exposure did not guarantee punishment, but secrecy had been broken. That mattered. Before leaving, the bordermen removed Krail from Belgrave under guard. Several Nightriders were disarmed and released without their horses. They carried the truth back to neighboring plantations whether they intended to or not. Silas cut Sabella's bindings. She walked directly to Tavrin. The escape had succeeded. Dozens had crossed the open roads while the patrol remained trapped in the garden. That fact did not reduce what lay in front of her. Sabella placed the wooden mortar beside Tavron's hand. Blood had darkened its base where it touched the soil. She stayed there until the smoke thinned. Then she stood. The garden could no longer protect her. Belgrave's owners would retaliate as soon as they understood the scale of the escape. Surviving patrolmen would return with more men. The burial ground might now be known, but knowledge alone could not shield Sabella from the system she had exposed. She left Georgia before the next nightfall. Tavron was buried beside the oldest thorn growth, separate from Crail's victims but within the ground he had defended. Sabella took little with her: the wooden mortar, her medical tools, several wrapped roots, a cloth bag filled with seeds. Silas crossed with her, walking slowly but refusing assistance until they reached the creek. Months later, armed men returned to Belgrave. They cut down the remaining thorn walls. They burned the dried vines. They tore apart the buried frames Tavron had built and scattered soil across the opened graves. They believed destruction would restore control. After the first heavy rain, new shoots appeared. The roots beneath the ground had survived. Then reports began arriving from farther south. Greenbrier had been trained across a patrol road near the Florida line. Cherokee Rose appeared beside an abandoned crossing. Hollow gourds sounded at night near a settlement Crail's men had never entered. The pattern spread westward. The explanation was simple. Every adult Sabella had guided through the garden carried seeds, cuttings, or knowledge of the signals. Some planted memorials. Others marked water routes. A few built narrow corridors designed to slow horses. There had never been one fortress. Belgrave was a school. Sabella had taught people how to turn ordinary growth into warning, concealment, memory, and delay. She knew the first garden could be discovered. She knew it could be burned. That was why its most important product was never the thorns. It was instruction. The Nightriders had surrounded one woman and destroyed one piece of land. By then, the method had already crossed the border in dozens of hands. Tavron died protecting a garden. Sabella made certain it would not remain the only one. Subscribe for more buried stories of resistance, survival, and the people history tried to erase. Then comment your city, state, or country below, and share your theory. Did Sabella always intend to sacrifice the Belgrave garden, or did Tavron's death force her to turn it into something larger? I'll be reading your theories, and I want to see how far these seeds have traveled.